The diamond necklace gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the mansion's marble foyer, its brilliance cutting through the early morning shadows like a beacon of impossible hope. Margaret Chen, a 62-year-old cleaning woman with arthritic hands and worn sneakers, stood frozen, her cleaning cart abandoned beside her, as she stared at the jewelry piece that had fallen from her uniform pocket. She'd found it wedged between the sofa cushions an hour earlier, and in that single moment of weakness, that brief, desperate thought of her grandson's medical bills, of the foreclosure notice on her daughter's apartment, of the crushing weight of poverty that had defined her entire life, she had slipped it into her pocket. Now, as footsteps thundered down the grand staircase, she knew her moment of weakness was about to destroy everything she'd spent a lifetime building. "That's my wife's necklace! My deceased wife's necklace!" The voice that shattered the morning silence belonged to Richard Thornwood, the tech magnate whose 15,000-square-foot estate Margaret had cleaned faithfully for the past 8 years. His face was contorted with rage and grief as he descended the stairs. Still in his silk pajamas, his silver hair disheveled. "How dare you! How dare you!" Margaret's legs trembled. She wanted to explain, to tell him that she hadn't stolen it, not really, that she'd found it and was going to return it. But the words died in her throat, because that wasn't entirely true, was it? For those 60 desperate minutes, she had imagined what that necklace could mean. Freedom, security, a chance. "Mr. Thornwood, she began, her voice barely a whisper. 8 years! He stood before her now, his eyes blazing. 8 years I've trusted you in my home, around my things, around the memory of my Catherine, and this is how you repay that trust?" The necklace lay between them on the floor where it had fallen, catching the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was exquisite, white gold intertwined, with diamonds in a delicate pattern that reminded Margaret of cherry blossoms. She'd seen Mrs. Thornwood wear it in the photographs that still adorned every room of the house, her smile radiant, her eyes full of life. Catherine Thornwood had died 3 years ago from ovarian cancer, and her husband had never recovered. "I found it in the sofa," Margaret said quietly, meeting his eyes despite her fear. "I was going to return it to you, Mr. Thornwood, I swear on my mother's grave." "Then why was it in your pocket?" His voice cracked, and Margaret saw what lay beneath the anger, raw, unhealed grief. "Why wasn't it in my hands the moment you found it?" This was the question she couldn't answer, not honestly, not without admitting the darkness that had whispered to her in that moment of discovery, the voice that said nobody would ever know. You could finally rest. You could finally help your family. "Because," Margaret said, and tears began streaming down her weathered cheeks, "because for just a moment I was tired of being poor. I was tired of choosing between medication and groceries. I was tired of watching my daughter work 3 jobs and still lose her home. I was tired of seeing my grandson suffer because we can't afford the treatment he needs." She looked down at her hands, permanently reddened from decades of cleaning chemicals. "For one moment I was so tired that I forgot who I was." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard Thornwood stared at her, and Margaret waited for the inevitable. The police, the charges, the public humiliation, the end of the only thing she had left, her good name. But then something unexpected happened. Richard's shoulders sagged, and he sank down onto the marble steps, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. "Catherine wore that necklace on our first date," he said, his voice hollow. "I saved for 6 months to buy it. We were students then, both broke, but I wanted to give her something beautiful, something that matched how she made me feel." He looked up at Margaret with red-rimmed eyes. "I thought I'd lost it. I've been searching for weeks. It was the last piece of her I had left that I could actually hold." Margaret felt her heart break. She had almost stolen this man's most precious memory for money. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Richard picked up the necklace, holding it gently, reverently. Then he looked at Margaret. Really. Looked at her, perhaps, for the first time in 8 years. "Tell me about your grandson." The question caught her off guard. "Sir, your grandson. What treatment does he need?" Margaret hesitated, confused by the turn in conversation. "He has leukemia. He's only 9 years old. The treatment he needs? It's experimental, not covered by insurance. My daughter has been trying to raise money, but... She trailed off, unable to continue. Richard stood, still clutching the necklace. And your daughter is facing foreclosure? Yes, sir. How much? I don't understand. How much does she owe? How much does your grandson's treatment cost? How much do you need? Margaret's mind reeled. Mr. Thornwood, I don't expect... I asked you a question, Margaret. His voice was firm but not unkind. How much? The numbers tumbled out, staggering amounts that represented years of struggle, the arithmetic of desperation that Margaret carried in her head every waking moment. When she finished, Richard nodded slowly. You know what Catherine would have done? He said, more to himself than to her. She would have given you the necklace. She would have handed it to you, the moment she learned about your grandson and told you to sell it. He laughed. But it was a sad sound. She was always giving things away, driving me crazy with her generosity. After she died, I held on to everything so tightly because I was afraid of losing her completely. I turned into someone she wouldn't recognize. He held up the necklace, watching it catch the light. This was supposed to be a symbol of love, not a prison for my grief. He looked at Margaret. You found it, and in that moment of weakness, you showed me something I'd forgotten. That desperation can touch anyone. That we're all human. That we all have breaking points. Mr. Thornwood. He held up his hand. Let me finish. You could have walked out of here with this necklace. You could have sold it, disappeared, started over, but you didn't. Even in your darkest moment. Even when you were tired of struggling, you couldn't do it. That tells me everything I need to know about who you really are. Richard walked to his study and Margaret heard him making phone calls. When he returned 20 minutes later, he carried a folder. I've arranged for your daughter's mortgage to be paid in full. I've also contacted St. Jude's Research Hospital. They've agreed to cover your grandson's treatment under a charitable program I'm funding. Your daughter will receive a job offer from one of my companies by the end of the week, with full benefits and a salary that will allow her to support her family comfortably. Margaret's legs gave out. She sank onto the bottom step, covering her face with her hands, her whole body shaking with sobs. Why? She managed to ask. Why would you do this? Richard sat beside her, still holding the necklace. Because Catherine taught me that love isn't about holding on to things. It's about letting them do what they were meant to do. This necklace was meant to be a gift, a symbol of love and generosity. And today, it fulfilled that purpose. Just not in the way I expected. He smiled. And for the first time since his wife's death, it reached his eyes. Besides, I've spent 3 years holding on to grief. Maybe it's time I hold on to something else, like the memory of who Catherine really was and the kind of man she wanted me to be. He handed Margaret the folder with all the documentation. You've cleaned my house for 8 years, Margaret. But today you cleaned my heart. You reminded me what it means to be human, flawed, struggling, but ultimately good. That's worth more than any necklace. As Margaret left the mansion that morning, the rising sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. Her cart rolled behind. Her for the last time, Richard had insisted, she retire with a pension. She thought about the strange turns life takes, how a moment of weakness had somehow led to this impossible grace. Behind her, through the mansion's windows, she could see Richard Thornwood sitting in his late wife's favorite chair, holding the cherry blossom necklace, smiling through his tears. And for the first time in 3 years, he was talking to Catherine's photograph, not about loss, but about love, about second chances, about a cleaning woman who reminded him that the best way to honor the dead is to live generously among the living. In the end, the necklace had been found exactly where it needed to be, not in a safe, not around anyone's neck, but in the space between two broken people who needed to remember that kindness and forgiveness could still exist in a world that often seemed devoid of both. Sometimes the most precious things we own are meant to be given away, and sometimes our darkest moments illuminate the path toward our most profound redemption.